Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Women of the Word podcast. Today we're excited to welcome another guest to the podcast, Colleen Searcy. Welcome, Colleen. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Lauren. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thanks for being here. Just as a reminder, over the next few episodes, Jen and I are going to continue our discussion about Bible literacy and specifically the importance of Bible literacy in other ministry spaces. And today, Colleen is going to help us do that in relation to the teaching time.
Super excited about it.
Us too.
I have been so looking forward to having you on, Colleen. You and I go back a long way. Would you like to tell everyone how long we've known each other and in what capacity?
I would love to, and feel free to correct numbers, but in my mind, you know what? What goes along with knowing each other a long time means we're getting a little
Right.
older. So feel free to correct my numbers. But I think it was like 2008
Mhm.
when we met and started the large group women's Bible study.
Mm.
And yeah, so it's been a long time. And I remember meeting over coffee at Corner Bakery. Was it Corner Bakery?
Yes.
And we were terribly excited as we realized we had found we had found one another, and just our excitement for discipling women and Bible
Mhm.
study. And I think my first role when we started Bible study was I was on the teaching team, but I think my
Mhm.
primary role was small group leader coordinator.
Mhm. That
Yeah,
sounds right. That
yeah.
sounds right. And then I remember the first time that you stood up to teach, and I thought, "Okay, here we go," because I wasn't really sure. I didn't know
Yeah, you
whether
had
you could
never
teach or
heard.
not, which we're not suggesting that as a model for ministry for those of you out there, but it was desperate times. And you just taught your face off. And do you remember they didn't capture the recording and we made you do it again?
I do. I really do remember that.
Yeah, but we've known each other a long time, and just that I still remember just that discovery of, "Oh, we have the same vision for this." And so it's
Mhm.
fun for me to see where the Lord has taken you over the last how many years would that be? 16, 17 years?
Yeah.
Wow, that is quite a long time. Colleen is now a published author through Crossway with the Meet Me in the Bible series, which
Yes,
is
she is.
very much in the same realm as the kind of work that I'm doing with more of a hands-on. How would you describe it? You describe it, Colleen, more of a hands-on approach.
Yeah, yeah, so it's, like you said, super similar, and we knew that, right, since we've
Right.
known each other for
Yep.
such a long time. It's a framework that leans on the time-tested stages of Bible reading. So observation, interpretation, and application. Meet Me in the Bible framework uses questions that are evergreen. So you can use these same questions for any book of the Bible. And it's kind of this unique combination of scripture journal and Bible reading guide.
Mhm.
And so there are prompts included in Meet Me in the Bible framework to help move you through the three stages of Bible reading. So the prompts move you through observation, then interpretation, then application.
And an added bonus, it's spiral bound, which we all
It is
know is
spiral
what women
bound.
truly want. So,
They do, and they want quality paper, which Crossway does excellently, and the corners are rounded. Women, we love these things. They are important to us, so
well, you're joining us for the third section of the three-legged stool conversation. Those who've listened to the podcast for a while know that
mhm.
we talk about the three-legged stool of learning, which is comprised of individual study time or curriculum, and then small group time, and then finally the teaching time. And I know
Mm.
you are familiar with this because you got to hear me say it at the beginning of every semester if you yourself were not saying it when we were teaching together. And so I'm hoping that today, what you can help us with is to give us eyes on your preparation process. How do you think about that teaching space as it relates to the other two pieces that have come before? But before we jump into that, I'm just curious to know, like, when you think about teaching the Bible, what do you really love about it? Like, what
Mm,
gets you excited? And then I guess the other piece of that question is always, what is the challenge as you're preparing?
mm. What comes to my mind first when you ask the question, "What do you really love about Bible study?" is the Bible's the primary way God reveals himself to us, and so why wouldn't we want to create spaces and
Hmm.
opportunities for men and women? I'm gonna speak to women primarily since that's the world I primarily run in, but we want to it just gives me so much joy to create spaces and opportunities for women to get to take a deep dive into the Bible. That's how they're gonna get to know God better and better since
Hmm.
it's the primary way he reveals himself. And B, the question I think in every woman's mind is, how do I live? Like, how do I live this one life that God's given me in a way that's pleasing to Him? And Bible study helps us do those two things,
Yep.
know God better and helps us live. It's a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. So it makes me super happy. And just as I think about women too, and it's just, there's also joy in creating an undistracted space where they can come
Mhm.
sit in there and be undistracted for a little bit and get to focus and be with other women, talk about the scriptures, and then sit and soak it in for a little bit.
Mhm. Mhm. What about challenges? Anything feel challenging to you when you get ready to prepare a teaching?
No, it's just I
It's
find it
all
to be like
joyful,
it
yeah, it's
is.
just
It's just I feel like Snow White and the birds start singing. Um, it does feel like that sometimes. Gosh, challenging. The first thing that comes to mind, a challenge with Bible study, is I always have more to say
Mm.
than there is time to
Mhm.
say it.
Mhm.
And so paring down a teaching session, man, so we're in Judges right now, just a light topic.
Definitely.
That's
Just
what I've
pare
been
the whole thing down.
just,
Just go home, everyone.
we're in the yeah, we're studying Judges, in our women's Bible study right now, and we just did chapters 4 and 5, so
Mhm.
Deborah and Barak and Jael. Chapter 4, the main plot. Chapter 5, the song about it, the victory song about it, and that is really hard to pare that down to 45 minutes.
Mhm.
So that feels challenging. The other thing that I would say feels challenging is just as you're preparing a teaching session, you're thinking about every person in the room, from
Mhm.
the person who just came to faith to the person who's sitting in the room that does not know the Lord yet, to the woman that studied for 30, 35 years, to the woman who's coming into the room grieving, like holding all of that as you prepare to teach and wanting to teach in a way that's meaningful and impactful to all everybody in the room. That weight hasn't lifted at all in the
Mhm.
15, 16, 17 years that I've been vocationally teaching women's Bible study.
I think that's a
Yeah.
really important piece too, because it's like I've often said, I started out because I love to teach the Bible, but I didn't love to teach women the Bible. And
Mm.
I had to learn to
Mm,
love the women who were sitting in front of me. And I see you do that really well. I think you're very sensitive to who is sitting there and you're trying to address the very real pastoral considerations of how the
mm,
text is going to be hitting them. There's a big difference between just standing up and delivering content.
mm.
Colleen, you talked a little bit about your process. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So, what is your process for preparing a teaching, and how has maybe that changed or stayed the same over the years that you've been teaching the Bible?
Yeah, my process of studying the Bible. Let me talk about what I do now first, and then I'll address like how it's changed a little bit over the
Perfect.
years. But an important piece of preparing to teach a Bible session again is just carefully and prayerfully considering your audience, and it piggybacks real well on what Jen and I were just talking about is considering who the audience is, and so I've led high school Bible studies in my home with primarily high school students that don't know the Lord, and I stand on a stage in front of a lot of women that do know the Lord or have been in Bible study, and so just coming to the Lord in prayer first, going, what do you want me to say?
Mhm.
What is it that you want to say to this audience? What do I need to be sensitive to? And just inviting him to lead as I prep. That's a really important part of preparation. I prepare my teaching session in the way I ask my participants to study. I
Mhm.
really do because I want to feel what they feel and I want to be a student first of the word. And so they may not believe me, but I really do study the way I ask them to study, and I know Jen because I sat under her teaching. It's the same thing she asks, and it's you engage with the text first.
Mhm.
I start with repetitive reading. I read the whole book that we're about to jump into several times. Yeah, and so after I start with repetitive reading, again, my preparation looks a whole lot like their study. And so to start answering the questions that I saw in repetitive reading, the questions that surfaced, I will look at cross references. I will read other translations of the Bible. I will look up definitions and synonyms in a dictionary. I will look up original language. And so I do very, very similar things that our participants are asked to do as they study. And I begin to add insights that I gain through cross references, other translations. I begin to add that, and my teaching session begins to form. And after I do all of that is when I look at a commentary
Mhm.
or I'll look at a study Bible. And this feels like a real important, what's the word I'm looking for? I used to start with commentaries when I taught early on because I felt so much tension, like I've got to understand this. And so I'd go
Mhm.
straight to commentaries. But I feel like as Bible teachers, if we start with commentaries, it's just too easy to end up parroting the commentator that is your favorite. And so again, my teaching process looks so much like the study process that we ask both that meet me in the Bible framework and the way we study the Bible at my church. I do the same things they do, and I end with commentaries and footnotes and study Bibles and add some insight in there.
Well, I think we've talked a lot about in previous episodes about how you want to build dissonance for the learner, like you want the learner to feel what they don't know yet. But what you're saying, and what is my experience as well, is that I need to feel that dissonance. I need
Yeah.
to feel it. And even if it's that I do go into it, maybe knowing a little more than the students who are going to show up, I still need to remember what I didn't know and feel what I still don't know so that when I go to the commentaries, I'm hearing them at the right time in the process because otherwise you might misjudge kind of where the room is when you start
It's
going to a
so good.
commentary and looking for the questions that the commentator was looking to answer, but they may not be the questions that have been raised in the work that the students did before they came, or they may not be the main thing that that person sitting in front of you is grappling with. And so there are things that the commentaries are going to point to that everyone agrees on. And then there are different emphases that you'll find there. And finding that right emphasis is something that I think takes a lot of time and experience
No,
to get
that's really
comfortable with.
good.
So getting comfortable with
That's really
things
good.
is another thing to think about. I remember the first time I heard you teach, and I thought, okay, she's had some experience. Like, this is not nobody just, like, gets up there on their first time and is this composed and this you were polished, and I mean that in a good way, like, not in a, like, professionalized, but just, like, you had the confidence of what you were gonna
Mm.
say, and you had mastery of, like, rhetorical skills. You knew how to use story, and you knew how to use humor in ways that supported what you were saying, but didn't overwhelm what you were saying. And so I would just be curious, like, as you have grown in your teaching skill and practice, what are the things that do feel easier for you? And what are the things that feel like they take a lot more work?
That's a great question. I think this is helpful to know. I was in the classroom teaching before I was
Yeah.
teaching the Bible. And so, and well, a lot of times it was simultaneous, but I mean, I started when I think about teaching the Bible, I mean, really I started as a college intern teaching middle school
Mhm.
girls, and a lot of this is just learned, right? And then I was a classroom teacher, taught high school biology and middle school life science, and that was really helpful in becoming a Bible teacher is I had a front row seat to a lot of different learning styles, and I got to see how to engage different learning styles. And so I say all that to answer your question, Jen. What feels a little easier to me is knowing how to put together an outline,
Mhm.
like organizing a teaching session that doesn't feel hard. And then it's a joy and kind of this challenge that I love is how can I pull in different, ways to engage different learning styles in the room? So that feels a little more intuitive to me. Yeah,
Yeah.
is that the answer to the question?
Yeah. What's hard?
Okay.
What are you still wrestling through every time?
Oh, so many things. Again, knowing what to cut
Yeah.
out. That is so hard,
Mhm.
and there's just as y'all know, scripture is so rich, and it just feels terrible the day before you teach or even, maybe even an hour before you teach, let's say, hypothetically, what to leave on the cutting room
Yeah.
floor, and so just learning to rest and trust the Lord's guidance as you prep and learning to trust that He is more passionate about his word than I
Mhm.
am, and he'll make sure that his children are equipped with his word, and I don't have to teach every single part of the text, and it's not an obedience issue,
Mhm.
but just resting in him that they'll hear a lot of teaching throughout the course of their lives, and that God will be faithful to equip men and women with what they need from his word. But that feels so challenging every time I
Mm.
teach, and I thought it would have gotten easier by now, but paring it down feels really hard. Yeah, that feels
Well, and it's one of the
challenging.
advantages, frankly, of being in a local church setting, teaching a study of
Yeah.
some length, right? Because, like, I had a good friend say to me once when I had overpacked the teaching time, she said, "You're going to get to teach him again. You don't have to say it all." But you're like, "But will I? Maybe this is the only chance I'll ever get." And when you're teaching in a like on a team, like we did, like you don't have to just knock it out of the park or say every single thing in that one time. You get to build trust with your
Mhm.
listeners. You get to enjoy the shared burden of the teaching with the other teachers, and that's just very, very different than, like, I've got this one shot to stand up here and just
Mm.
really knock your socks off, but it does feel that way every time. It's and we would constantly say to each other, like, "They don't know what you didn't say, they only know what you said," and so we can be really hard on ourselves, I think, on the back end of a teaching because you're
Mm.
Yeah.
remembering all the things that you meant to say
Yep.
or that you hoped to work in and you
Mhm.
forgot, and your student has no
So good.
idea about that.
They don't. And
Yeah.
the way that you say it, like, sometimes
Mm.
the way it looks in your
Mm,
notes, you're like,
yeah.
"Oh, I didn't say it that I had it written so great." And I got all excited and anyway, that's such a good point, Jen. What can I address another
Yeah.
challenge? And it's gonna actually go back and answer another question too. Another challenge of teaching is you're so excited about what you've learned and what you've discovered in your preparation. I don't know that every teacher feels this. I'm sharing this as a challenge for me. I have to purposely cut content and put in time to make a call to action.
Yes.
Mm.
And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but I'm being vulnerable because it's gonna help somebody
Mhm.
that's teaching the Bible that there are those of us who are so stinking excited about the content that we're going to be tempted to go, "I ran out of time." To talk about how we're going to apply
Mhm.
this. And that is a challenge because we don't want Bible study to terminate on us. We want to study it well and then we want to go live it well. And so, Lauren, I think you asked me, how has my process changed? My
Yep.
process of teaching prep changed. And I would say that's the biggest change in my teaching prep is I force myself to go, as sad as it makes me to cut this bit of content, I have to make some kind of call to action. Women are in the room, they're undistracted. Now is the time to consider how this will change our lives and how this is going to impact next week or the week after. And so, yeah,
So
I
good.
wanted to circle back to that.
Yeah. As someone who is on just the receiving end of Bible teaching, I just will take what is given to me and think that was helpful. Thank you. I guess like whenever you were talking about cutting content
Mhm.
or trying to fit in a specific amount of time, whenever you do that, like are you trying to think like I'm only going to put in things that I think my participants are going to have questions about, or I'm going to focus on things they might not have considered, or I'm going to focus on I don't know. I guess, like, what is there, like, a focus or questions you ask yourself that, like, help you know what to cut based on, like, who's listening to you? Just as somebody who hears teaching, I just take what I'm given. I'm like, "That was great."
Oh, that's such a good point. I needed to hear that. I live in my head so much. Maybe we're beating ourselves up too much. So I would say this. So those are such good questions. I would say one thing I have learned, a question I ask myself now is what's the thrust of the
Mhm.
text?
Okay.
What was the author saying to his original audience? Because the Holy Spirit inspired that author to write those things down. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Jen. The Holy Spirit inspired that author to write those things down for them and for then. And yes, he also inspired the author to write those things down for us and for always. But when content's growing and growing and growing, and I find myself cross referencing all over the place, I go, wait, 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 wait. what's the thrust of the text?
Mhm.
And so when I'm teaching Judges, I'm gonna make sure I taught Judges really well, and I didn't go over to the New Testament and
Yes.
actually teach Colossians instead of
Mm.
Judges. That's a really big question that I ask myself. What's the thrust of the text? I'm getting cheers from Jen,
Yes.
which just makes me so happy. I made my teacher
Ah,
proud.
there's a reason I
That's
invited
the
you on.
that's the biggest question I ask myself. I consider the audience. I consider what feels hard to understand.
Mhm.
I'm prayerful about all of that. So I'm asking myself lots of questions. In fact, everything you just asked, Lauren, is considered as you prep. But the overarching question I'm asking is, am I handling this text well? And so if this illustration needs to be said another time, if this cross
Mhm.
reference needs to be pulled in
Mm.
another time, I need to make sure the thrust of the text is covered well. Does that help? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. That's really
Okay, great.
helpful. I just wasn't sure if there was specific things that you kind of went through in your mind of how to make those decisions if you do have to cut things for the teaching time.
Yeah.
Colleen sounds very honorable and well thought through. For me, this is really bad, but the ways that the teaching grows for me in ways that it shouldn't is because a story takes longer to tell than it should, because maybe I didn't think about it beforehand about how to keep it within the limits.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that I have to confess to the Lord about is hobby horses. Like if there's something
Mhm.
that I just feel like they don't get this, and this is being said wrong by a lot of people, I can devote too much time to waging war with people who are not even in the room about something that I want to be clear to the women who are. And so it's not that you can't talk about things that are kind of stuck in your craw, but I do find that anytime I'm teaching from a place of frustration or anger, which is not a
Mhm.
place you should be teaching from, just for our listeners, that's when I can often let the time get away from me. So there you go.
Mm,
There's my
that's
shallow
helpful.
reasons that things
No,
go
that's
awry.
helpful.
Mhm.
Oh, that's super helpful. I love that you just shared that. I think too, and I think, Jen, you would agree with this. I think another big question to ask is, have I covered the pressing questions
Yeah.
of the text? And I have been a participant before when I was just eager to hear a
Mhm.
topic. And I don't expect the teacher to be a mind reader, but when there are clearly confusing
Right.
parts of the text that are just flat not
Mhm.
acknowledged, that I think that's a big question to ask as a teacher is, even if you acknowledge the tension in the text with, "I'm not
Yeah, the
100% sure,"
complexity. Mhm.
but don't just not talk
Yeah,
about it.
absolutely.
I think that's another the thrust of the text, consider your audience, and then acknowledge the most pressing
Well, and
questions
this
that the t
yeah, this
yeah,
brings
go
us back around to this idea we've been talking about of the three-legged stool, because a good curriculum should be introducing those questions. It should be raising those questions in the minds of the learner, and so then when you come in to do the teaching time, you're keeping that in view. Like, part of, I think, working through the whatever the homework element is that they've been given is putting yourself in the seat of the learner and thinking, "What did they really have a hard time answering?" Because if I don't teach that, they're not just gonna be frustrated, they're probably gonna be mad. They're gonna come find me afterwards and say, "You skipped over that." But I think too, when we don't address those questions, we're communicating that either we're afraid to, or that those questions are too hard to answer. And so I do think, and I've seen you do this so well where you'll say, I'm not there are multiple views on this, but here's where I land and here's why, and giving a fair shot at what the other views are in the teaching. I bet, you and I are basically
yeah,
the same age. We grew up in an era of teaching where it
yeah,
was like, nope, here's the one view.
yep,
And then you find out later that there were two or three. And it feels
mhm,
like someone has manipulated you or withheld things from you on purpose. And so I think that's one thing actually I've seen you do that you're really good at, is saying there are different ways to think about this. And here's where I land and here's why. But you should really think further about this on your own.
yeah,
If it's not a matter of orthodoxy, of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really good.
Mhm.
So, Colleen, when you teach, you're definitely not teaching to just one person. There's lots of people in the
Mhm.
room that you're teaching. So, how, whenever you teach, do you approach balancing theological depth with accessibility? So that way your teaching can reach people that might have different levels of understanding. Where do
That's
you
a
have
great
that
question.
balance?
Yeah, I fight for that balance, and that's a balance worth fighting for with all the different people in the room, and so one of the many things I learned from Jen from listening to her teaching, and I think you call it $50 words, is that right? Am I using the
Something
right
like that, yeah.
something like that? Everybody benefits from simple language.
Mhm.
And so everybody, the woman that's been studying for 35 years and the woman who this is her first Bible study. And so using simple language, or if you introduce a fancy word, a theological word like hypostatic union or something like that, you're to honor everyone in the room, you come behind it with a simple definition in plain
Mm.
language. I think that's a big one. I tell a funny story when I do workshops on how to teach the Bible about an exercise class that I went to. And look, I wish I loved exercise. I love the Bible. I do not like exercise.
It's
And so it
another
was a
reason we're
big
friends.
deal. Yeah, so yeah, another thing we have in common. Take us to coffee, don't ask us to
Right.
go work out together. But I went to this exercise class. It was a big deal. I already felt vulnerable because it's not a world that I know. And I was so delighted because the instructor used such plain language. I followed along. I loved it. I went home excited to come back. And when I came back the next week, they had a new instructor and she was totally different. She was using all this verbiage that I had no familiarity with. I couldn't follow her. It was embarrassing. And I never went back. And it's a kind of a dramatic example, but we don't want Bible study to
Mhm.
feel like that. And so that plain, simple language is really important. I do like to throw in something for everybody, like, again, considering the whole audience. So, like last fall, when we were studying Joshua and we did the story of Rahab, we dove into the depths of that story and the intricate layers of the story, and I shared the gospel.
Mhm.
I think Rahab is such a great
Mhm.
example of God's eager to save all who call on his name. And so that's just one example of let's go into the depths and I'm gonna share the gospel, and there was a simple gospel presentation woven in there. I love to use visuals, paintings, every once in a while, personal stories, use a current event, just anything that's just tapping onto into different people's learning styles and interests. But yeah, I think mainly simple language,
Mhm.
even if you're explaining a doctrine
Mhm.
or a story that everybody knows.
And shared language. I mean,
Yeah,
that's something that we've done as a
yeah,
teaching team. Like when we were teaching through Proverbs,
yeah. Oh,
we had
that's
a
a good
shared
one.
definition for wisdom that we used each week, and then we've done a lot around the attributes. We use the same language to talk about the attributes of God. We use them all the way down into our children's ministry, which is something we'll get to talk about in some episodes along here. And so the more that your teaching team is sharing vocabulary
Mm,
and language,
that's
the
good.
more you're layering that repetition is the mother of learning. And they're seeing, oh, we're all on the same page with this. And I think also there's another thing that Colleen has pointed out a couple of times that if you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking, oh, I need to build a teaching team, but how do I know who to ping? I was just talking to somebody about this earlier today. You probably have women who are teaching in your middle school or high school ministry. And because
Yep.
they know how to teach to that level, stepping
Yeah.
into the adult space is so easy for them because they already know how to take complex ideas and communicate them simply,
Yeah.
and you just never outgrow your need for that.
So
And I
good.
think that's one of the reasons that, as you've already said, Colleen, that I think it was pretty easy for you to step. It doesn't mean it's easy work, but it was easy for you to have the confidence to
Yeah.
step in and start because you're like, I mean, I can explain things to kids who don't even want to be in the room when I'm learning them. So, a
It's
bunch
so
of women who
true.
like jumped through a million hoops to get here, and are already dialed in. This is a cakewalk. And so I would say if you're in your local church and you're wondering, where do I go to build a team? I'd start poking around to see who's been teaching and leading in that student ministry space or people who have a background in teaching. Those are going to be, or a background, in a parachurch Bible study context. We've gotten a lot of our best people who wanted to serve in the local church after being in a parachurch space for a while. So, but I
Good.
wish we could talk for another 2 days. Basically, you and I need to have coffee. We've been trying to do that
Yes.
for months, but we're going to do it. Uh,
Yes. It's gonna
yeah.
happen
But
soon.
in the interest of time and just making sure that the people who are listening get just the best little nuggets that Colleen Searcy has to offer. If there's a new teacher or someone who's like thinking about, I think I want to do this and I want to get started, what would be your best little nuggets of advice that you would give to someone who is thinking about dipping their toe in?
The first thing that comes to mind, and I've heard you say this so many times, is start in your living
Mhm.
room. When Jen and I met, we were both teaching Bible studies in our living
Mhm.
room and had been for a while. So start, and I would start with a mentor. Even if that mentor, they may not be a vocational Bible teacher, or but as Jen said, you can find someone who's been in education, you can find someone who has been leading and teaching in some way. Put your first outline together and share it with that mentor and ask for feedback. I think those 2 things, starting and just starting, and it could be across your kitchen table, but start and invite a mentor in immediately, someone who will give you honest feedback and help you grow
Mhm.
in your strengths and share your weaknesses in a loving way. "Hey, work on this," but, "Hey, this was great."
Mhm.
And those are the first 2 things that come to mind.
That's really good advice.
Really good advice. Well, thank you so much, Colleen. As someone who is not a Bible teacher, that was encouraging and helpful for me to just kind of hear how much time and work and care you put into what you do and to teach the Bible. So, thank you so much to both of you for joining us, and we'll see all of you next time.